Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined again by Matt Segall. Matt has been a frequent interlocutor, and we are hoping to continue a conversation that we started last time. And at that point, we'd already had a couple of conversations under our belt. But I'd love to continue the conversation with Matt. Matt, whom I introduced previously, and so therefore needs no introduction. But if one needs to be given, I could summarize him as a brilliant mind, philosopher, process thinker, deeply engaged with the philosophy of Whitehead and other process thinkers, and generally exploring the same sort of space that I'm interested in, and at the same time coming to different kinds of conclusions about issues of evolutionary spirituality, consciousness, and the whole shebang. So we had a really lovely conversation last time that went pretty deep into metaphysics and physics and whatnot. And I'd love to continue some of that today, with the one caveat, which is that I am slightly under the weather and a little ill and a bit fuzzier in mind than usual. So I hope that I can keep up with Matt's brilliance, and but we'll see. But Matt, thanks again for coming back on the podcast.
Good to continue the conversation, Brendan. And yeah, appreciate your efforts here. And if it's any consolation, I'm at a bit of a handicap myself. Didn't sleep that well. Had to get up early for some meetings with some folks on the other side of the Atlantic this morning. So
Great.
uh, I won't be at my best either.
Okay, well, yes. So between your sleep deprivedness and my, um, I don't know, flu-induced half hallucinogenic state of consciousness, we'll get to something significant. I hope. Well, thank you. So here's where I'd like to start for this conversation. We had talked last time about picking up. Uh, Exploring the spectrum of consciousness and trying to get drill down into prehension and that sort of a thing. And that seemed like a really fascinating topic, and I would like to do that still. But one thing happened in the interim between our last conversation and this one, which is that I did get my hands on a copy of The Blind Spot. And that work has been really great in further illuminating a lot of things that you've been constructively harping on for a long time now. In fact, there was a point at which I even flipped to the back to the acknowledgments to see if you were listed as like an early reader of this, because there were many things coming up in that book that I'd heard you making these points, and issues about Bergson and Einstein and time and misplaced concreteness, Whitehead, all this stuff. And I'm like, this is I almost felt like I was reading a book that you'd written. So a lot of that seemed very very in your wheelhouse, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because that was also one of the potential frameworks for earlier discussions, which had to do with abstraction and misplaced concreteness, the issue of model making, the kind of errors of science, and how all this relates to consciousness and first person experience. And I can try to set that up a little bit more. I think it'll be clear, the continuity, the threads connecting back to our previous conversations. But actually, maybe I'll just put the onus on you if you'd like to try to set up a little bit, maybe of what the blind spot, where that kind of dovetails with a lot of your thinking, and some things that you'd like to foreground relative to the general thesis around this misplaced concreteness in scientific modeling, and the consequences of that. So maybe you could say a little bit about that. And I also know that you've written a piece. You reviewed that book and also added a few things of your own that you felt like should have been included. But yeah, start there and maybe set up some of these ideas, and then I'll pick it up and I'll kind of zoom in on some things. How does that sound?
Yeah, excellent. I take it as a high compliment that you would say you almost felt like I could have written this book. Don't know about that, but it's not surprising because at least one of the three authors, Evan Thompson, is someone who's really had a formative influence on me going back to my undergraduate days. I studied cognitive science at the University of Central Florida, and there was a professor named Sean Gallagher there, who's since left UCF. I forget where he teaches now, but he's an embodied phenomenologist. And most cognitive science back then, this would have been 2004 to 2007 roughly, was still heavily computational. I mean, it still is, but there was this enactivist paradigm that came out of phenomenology going back to Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, that was beginning to challenge the dominant cognitivist, computational understanding of what human cognition is. And I was lucky to be able to study with Gallagher, and he introduced me to the work of Francisco Varela, who was Evan Thompson's teacher. And
Hmm.
they wrote this book in the 90s called The Embodied Mind. Yeah, cognitive science and human
This one here.
experience. Yeah,
Yeah.
such a important text for me. Um, and then Evan's book in 2007, I think, Mind and Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind, I think is the subtitle. Um, you know, again, really core in shaping my basic outlook. And I've known for several years that he's been working on this book, bringing in Whitehead. I've been talking to Evan about Whitehead for many years, and to his father, William Owen Thompson, who was also very influenced by Whitehead, kind of integral philosopher. Um, and so, yeah, uh, I've been really shaped, deeply influenced by Evan's work. And Marcelo Gleiser and Adam Frank were new to me. I only discovered their work when I saw they were co-authors, but as astrophysicists, I believe they're both physicists of some kind, at least, very interested in how coming from within this intensely model-centric form of theoretical science, that they're able to recognize the limits better than anyone else of um, you know what physics is really all about, and the extent to which the decisions that have been made over the course of the history of science are somehow uh, uh, required by the phenomena themselves, which is to say, uh, they seem to both recognize, as does Evan, that science is a historical process. It's a cultural activity. There's a certain degree of social, political, economic, etc., a context that shapes how the theories get developed. And so that's a big part of what they're doing in this book, is uncovering looking at the history of science and looking at the formal procedure of coming up with uh, scientific models and the experiments which test those models, but also the human context of that model production, um, which gets them into phenomenology, and they draw on Husserl, they draw on Bergson, and they draw on Whitehead, at least his sort of middle period, I would say, when Whitehead's still coming out of mathematics and physics, hasn't fully transitioned into metaphysics. In between the period of 1919 and 1922, Whitehead publishes these three books, which you could say are in the philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, although one of them, the principle of relativity, is physics straight up. I mean, it's an alternative rendering of relativity with tensor equations and all. So there's a big chunk of that book that I can't decipher. Um, but it's, Whitehead's coming up with new tensor equations, uh, and introducing a new philosophy of nature in that text in 1922, responding directly to Einstein after he's published two prior books in 1919, Principles of Natural Knowledge, in 1920, The Concept of Nature. And it's the concept of nature that Thompson, Gleiser, and Frank are really drawing on in this text to talk about um, this bifurcation of nature that modern science introduces initially as a kind of methodological shortcut to focus
Mhm.
on the measurable quantitative aspects of our phenomenological encounter with the natural world, and to bracket the qualitative stuff that, Galileo, for example, would say is added by the subjective aspects of our organism, and that what science really wants to get at is what's outside of the organism's
Yeah.
perception, that is matter in motion.
Yeah.
And again, initially a methodological procedure. Descartes then kind of comes up with the metaphysical, sort of ontological version of this methodological procedure. And then very quickly in the course of modern history, as they detail, there we surreptitiously substituted, to
Hmm.
use Husserl's term, this methodological approach to model making became ontology,
Hmm.
and you get a mechanistic worldview out of this. And their point is that all of this modeling of mechanisms in nature presupposes something um, that cannot be explained in mechanistic terms, in principle, because it's our human experience, our embodied phenomenological direct experience, which becomes a very important phrase for them, that that it provides the transcendental condition for
Hmm.
scientific reflection, and that phenomena like time or life, which they get into in the book, can't be explained in the same terms that physicists since Galileo and others have attempted to explain the non-living world, and that there's some kind of strange loop, as they say, whereby to really understand consciousness, life, time, we need a post-physicalist ontology. And they don't provide that in this book, but it's more of a critical look at why the mechanistic ontology doesn't work,
Yeah.
and some hints about the direction we might want to go
Yeah.
in terms of imagining a non-bifurcated image of nature or cosmology, where the subjective stuff that Galileo put to the side
Hmm.
actually is brought back into the foreground.
Yeah. So, okay. So yeah, a lot there. That was a good, really good summary. And, you know, my sense of, what is captured in the idea of the blind spot then is essentially, yeah, our subjective phenomenological direct experience, which is the prerequisite for objective science, right? The subjective experience of phenomena is the basis by which we would attempt to do objective science. But that's precisely what gets removed from the equation as sort of noise, as Greg Enriquez talks about it. And for those familiar with Greg's U-Talk model, I mean, he's grappling with a lot of these same issues as well. He also read the book and did a review on it and whatnot. And be interesting to continue the conversation of, so much of this is sort of critique and pointing out the problems, and your work is trying to like point towards solutions. So is Greg, but I think there's also some disagreement about that. So, what we do with once we integrate this critique, I think is the really interesting stuff. And then also, in this conversation, I'd love to get a sense of, um, what is proper to that critique, because I guess I'll dive in at this point where um so I think, again, people will have a sense of the basic issue, hopefully, of what we're getting at here. And if not, go check out this book. It's a great kind of introduction to this problem. And broadly speaking, those familiar with the hard problem of consciousness and how this emerges from, really the presuppositions of science itself, in the sense that kind of creates the hard problem because of its own methodology that gets interpreted as an ontological reality that then can't solve for the very thing that allows it to ask the question in the first place. That's kind of the issue that we're dealing with here. And I'd like to go at all that, but by focusing first on this issue of abstraction, because one of the things that they talk about, is that science creates these abstractions that then it kind of gets this amnesia, then forgets that they're abstractions and thinks that they're actually more real than the actual kind of concrete experience. And so there's been this uh, relationship then to abstraction that I've heard in your own work as well. That's a bit, I don't know what the right word is. There's one is a bit wary of abstraction, let's say, right? That there's the danger of abstraction. And this isn't also other folks as well. Benita Roy is always talking about the dangers of getting, removed and into the level of abstractions and getting disconnected from the mind body. If you look at Ian McGilchrist's work and the whole emphasis on the left brain and all this stuff, similar kinds of critique, it's very clear that modernity in its project moved us in a direction that privileged this kind of way of seeing the world that hinged on mechanism, abstraction, rationalism, and then in the process created a lot of problems. So all this is sort of the broader context for this. And what I am curious about is what we make of abstraction, then, I guess you could say, because there's clearly a way in which abstraction serves us, that it's pointing to something about the nature of how reality works. At least I would claim, and invite your response to this. At the same time, we want to avoid the pitfall of what they're describing, of mistaking the map for the territory, essentially, of mistaking the abstraction for the actual experience. But what I'm concerned about as well is I don't want to go so far in the other direction either, that we start saying, oh no, evil abstraction, let's all just go back to our immediate sense perception and think that somehow this is going to put us in direct nature or direct contact with nature and reality. So I want to find that balance there, and I want to get your thoughts on that. What is the proper role of abstraction? Where does it reach its limits, if that's a right way of framing it? How do we find that right sweet spot where we're able to use our ability, our kind of apparently seemingly unique human ability of abstracting and then higher order, second order abstractions on abstractions? How do we use that in a way that actually connects us to reality rather than distancing us from reality? That's a first pass at this question.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, let me first of all just say that abstraction is not the enemy. Abstraction is unavoidable.
Mm,
So the problem is not abstraction, it's misplaced concreteness. So we want to be clear about what's more concrete and what's more abstract. And um, we want to not seek those. I mean, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is basically saying you cannot explain the concrete by the abstract. It's the inverse. You're always the satisfying explanation is always referring you to something concrete. We get confused, or we encounter problems when we're dealing with an issue at too high a level of abstraction. And what we want to do is drop into a more concrete relationship to the phenomenon so that we're no longer puzzled by it. But abstraction is unavoidable. And actually, let me quote something Whitehead says about this in his little book Symbolism, which is really his theory of perception in condensed form. Great little text. He says abstraction expresses nature's mode of interaction and is not merely mental. And by mental here, he means something human beings introduce. When it abstracts, human thought is merely conforming to nature, or rather, it is exhibiting itself as an element in nature. So, in other words, abstraction is part of nature. It's part of
mhm.
how nature engages in coarse graining. It's part of, in Whitehead's terms, when he talks about conceptual prehension, there are abstract possibilities being explored and decided among by actual occasions at other scales beyond the human being. Um, there's a very interesting debate that took place. It was a panel, but it ended up being a debate at Stanford between in the early 2000s between Richard Rorty, Isabel Stengers, and Donna Haraway. And Haraway and Stengers are both Whiteheadians, and Rorty studied Whitehead with Charles Hartshorne at the University of Chicago, wrote his
Huh.
master's thesis on Whitehead, but then sort of encounters Wittgenstein and Heidegger and Derrida, and gets into a more linguistic understanding of philosophy that for him, and this is the nature of their debate, abstraction is something introduced by human language, does not exist in nature. And so for Rorty, I don't want to caricature him, but I start to feel at least like I'm stuck in a kind of linguistic cage. This is a
Mhm.
kind of linguistic solipsism. Like you can't get outside of words. You're just coming up with new words that connect to old words. And
Yep.
uh, Stengers wants to say, leaning on Whitehead, that no, an oyster has its own way of abstracting certain salient features of its environment. Human language isn't the source of abstraction in nature. Our very sensory perception are the different channels of sensation,
Mhm.
vision, hearing, etc., are ways of abstracting certain features of the environment. Um, and so, Donna Haraway would say through her interaction with Cayenne, uh, her dog that she trained to run these courses competitively, obstacle courses, that there's a communication taking place that's non-linguistic, and they have to both. She has to learn to give up her human sense of how to communicate linguistically to contact her dog Cayenne's way of abstracting and way of signaling,
Hmm.
and learn to, they have to translate for one another.
Hmm.
And she thinks that is a, they're coordinating around certain abstractions together
Yeah.
that have nothing to do with human language, or
Well,
somewhere in between human language and the dog's understanding of that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
just a quick plug for Jason Storm's
Mm.
metamodern systematic philosophy. He has a semiotics he introduces or frames called hylosemiotics, in which a lot of this stuff would be right at home, which is that, language is not this infinite deferral of meanings the way those postmodern folks, some of whom you named, suggested, but that it connects back to the world, and also that, we can see pre-linguistic meaning making going on, whether that's dogs or other animals. And so whether we call that abstraction or something else, there's clearly ways that that there is a continuity there, that we're not just some uniquely human abstract thinkers that are inherently alienated from reality because of the thing that we uniquely are doing. And I think that anyway,
Yeah.
those interested in sort of a metamodern take on all of that, I think his hylosemiotics does a good job framing a lot of those issues in that book.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I studied that book with a student last semester, well, in the spring, and enjoyed it very much. Social process ontology is definitely, I think, the way forward for the humanities and religious studies. Um, Resolves a lot of unnecessary debates. But so what Whitehead wants to do is not demonize abstraction. I mean, the dude's a pretty
Hmm.
a top-notch logician who's very serious about pushing linguistic abstraction and symbolic logic as far as he can, and he experienced quite directly, sort of like slamming into it with his forehead, the limits of uh, formal logic. Um, when he worked on the Principia with Russell, and then lived to see and think about the implications of Gödel's incompleteness theorems and everything. Um, but Whitehead's philosophical project is really to look at the history of Western philosophy and see this emphasis on visual experience, which he would say is actually the most abstract sensory experience that we have, because it provides us with a picture of the external world, clear and distinct, defined edges. And Whitehead thinks that that's actually misleading if we want to understand, for example, what physics has revealed to us about the nature of the real world out there. It's not as clear and distinct and sharply defined. There's no such thing as an isolated entity in the physical universe. And so, as long as we don't get into the mistake of misplacing concreteness and thinking that some abstract model wherein we're thinking, I mean, and field theories don't do this anymore, but uh, when we start thinking of organisms isolated from their environments or particles isolated from their fields, we're dealing with a kind of abstraction which has no concrete reality.
Well,
Um,
let me ask you about
yeah.
that though, because that's an interesting. So you're also interested in the work of Goethe and Steiner, and like one of the things we've talked about as well is that Goethe had this whole theory of color that was very different from what kind of has now become the more dominant way of thinking about color, which is still very much dominated by this kind of primary secondary misplaced concreteness of, oh, how do we explain color? Well, there is no actual color. Color doesn't actually exist. It's a secondary property of our subjective experience. When we want to explain color, we actually have to revert to talking about the size of the wavelength of the light coming through, right? And I've heard you critique that as being like, but that's an abstraction. Like that would be a misplaced concreteness if we actually look at our own experience. We experience red. So to deny that as secondary and prioritize the wavelength theory of color would seem to be precisely a misplaced concreteness. At the same time, though, you're also saying our visual perception is itself an abstraction that is misplaced concreteness because we see clear edges. And so if we know from physics that there are no clear edges, then we should privilege that over what we see. So you see, I'm saying some kind of a potential discrepancy there, but do you see what I'm saying? How does that
What's
work?
concrete and what's abstract is always sort of relative.
Mm,
Um, so yes, visual experience is obviously more concrete than are models of the spin of electrons or something. And so
Hmm.
for us to say, oh no, really what's real is the spin of electrons in some kind of hyperdimensional, six-dimensional space or whatever, not spin of like a top that we'd see on a table,
Hmm.
that's somehow more real, that abstract model that's not even in a Euclidean form of geometry that we can imagine with any facility, at least, than our experience of color.
Hmm.
Then relative to color vision, yes, it's that model of higher dimensional spin of electrons that's more abstract. But Whitehead's point is that philosophy's been overly obsessed with visual experience as the paradigm of what the outside world is and what nature is, and has ignored our visceral experience of emotion and mood. And, the phenomenologists in the 20th century were hip to this too, trying to surface these other modalities of experience and subjectivity. And, just a quick note on what you were saying earlier about the importance of subjective experience. I think phenomenologists like um, already in Husserl, there's a sense of the object directedness. Like, what is consciousness?
Hmm.
It's intentionality, which is the object directedness of it.
Hmm.
So are we really talking about subjective experience? Because Husserl wants to think of subject object relations as, reciprocal, dialectical. It's not that we're just emphasizing subjectivity. We're emphasizing that objectivity is
Hmm.
itself a mode of presencing of this more primary thing that's not just subjective. And similarly, Heidegger wanted to break out of the whole word choice of subjectivity and talk
Hmm.
about Dasein and these other, ways of languaging that aren't suggestive of a Cartesian theater sort of interior uh, subjectivity. But anyways, Whitehead's emphasis on bodily feeling is his way of pointing to what's even more concrete than our visual experience, which is the feeling of transition, he would say, of the transmission of feelings. That we know from physiology that when I feel this warm mug, that there's some kind of a transmission from nerve endings in my hand up into my nervous system, my spinal cord, nervous system, and brain, and then there's a relay of feeling that's going on here.
Hmm.
And Whitehead wants to point out that rather than looking to visual experience of seemingly separated objects out there in external space, that maybe the better paradigm for understanding, say, causal relationships in nature would be by analogy to our bodily feeling of this kind of transmission of impressions,
Hmm.
uh, and that might give us more intuitive insight into what causality is concretely, which for him is a prehension, which is the transmission of feeling. And so that our own bodily experience, which is just at the threshold of our consciousness, we're not as conscious of it as the surfaces of the objects in our visual experience. But nonetheless, we all have, direct embodied, a direct embodied sense for the way in which feelings move through our body and the way emotions are located in our body and um, seem to surround and encompass us rather than uh, you know the way that the visual field can put us outside of things. We experience nature from the inside out in
Hmm.
these visceral feelings. And so for Whitehead, that's his bridge to panpsychism. He's not just trying to speculate that, oh yeah, rocks have minds. No, he's saying fill your body
Hmm.
and see if you can generalize from the feeling you have of being a body to what it might be to be other kinds of bodies in nature.
Right. Okay. So now this is a wonderful problem I have whenever I talk to you because as we get talking, there's so many thoughts, and then I know that I won't be able to, you know, because when I talk to you, there's like three thoughts I have in my mind, and I want to go there simultaneously, and now I have to choose, and but hopefully we can come to some of these. So, one of the thoughts, um, there's this sense that comes up a lot in the blind spot book, and I think that it's kind of dancing in the background of most of these conversations that we're having on this topic around something you could call ontological primacy, or what is often kind of the shorthand, which is like real or most real or something. And in fact, I wish I had the book at hand. In the blind spot, when they're outlining the blind spot and the trouble with it, they use this word real a lot. And they basically say, this is the problem, that we think that these models are more real, or that, we think that they're real rather than the thing that they're modeling, dot, dot, dot. That the abstraction is real and not the concrete reality. And so a lot is hinging on this notion of what we mean by real, or again, they use the phrase ontologically primary. Um, One of the things, though, that I got from Storm's work, for example, is his notion of meta realism, which is that word "real" actually is always a contrastive term, and so we have to be clear about what we're actually comparing something to. And a few minutes ago, you brought this up as well, that like this misplaced concreteness is in some sense always relative to what it is that we're talking about. Um, and so I want to kind of throw that into the mix here because you know there does seem to be this implicit notion that there is something that is deeply real, and then there's this kind of thing that layers on top of that, and then the whole notion of the blind spot and this way of thinking is that we wind up mistaking what's up here in the superstructure of reality that's actually built on this primary thing for what's really real instead of what's down here. And I find that a little bit problematic. And maybe you'd say that's a straw man and that's not actually what they're getting at. But unpack that a little bit, or just, I don't know, what's your response to that? How would you clarify what we're talking about when we're really trying to get at the real here? And do we need to be more specific and more kind of precise in our language around that?
Yeah, real is a charged word. I mean, on some level, it doesn't immediately have the sort of religious connotations that the word God does, but semantically it can function in
Mm,
a similar way. Like, how do you define it? Um, it's just a hierarchy, sort of a judgment about what you want to be taken more seriously than something else.
hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, in the context of what the argument that they make in this book, they're coming from a more or less phenomenological point of view, and you know they draw on Whitehead's early work in the concept of nature, where he doesn't use the term phenomenology. He wasn't aware of Husserl or um, Heidegger or anything like that. Although he would end up teaching a student at Harvard a few years later who had just studied with Husserl. But in any event, Whitehead in the concept of nature is still bracketing metaphysics and ontology. He's trying to define nature in a way that wouldn't lead to a bifurcation, and so he says nature is what we are aware of in perception,
Mm,
and science studies the systematic relationship among perceptions.
hmm
And we can't pick and choose what's in nature and what's not in nature. The redness of a sunset is as much part of nature as are the wavelengths that the physicists might refer to explain the color. Um, and so nature is what we are aware of in perception. And mind, Whitehead says, and what the relationship is between the perceiver and the perceived, that's a philosophical question. He's not trying to address that in the concept of nature. And they're not trying to address that in this book either. The phenomenological approach to these questions is to say, yes, consciousness is irreducible to any mechanistic model that a neuroscientist might come up with, because it's the condition that makes possible that kind of inquiry in the first place. And so, does that mean consciousness is more real than some kind of whatever theory they might come up with about how neural synchrony gives rise to the right pattern that integrates information, whatever the theory might be? It's going to be a model that presupposes the scientists animated by the purpose of arriving at the truth about consciousness.
Well, let me ask you this though. Here's a question. So hypothetically, if this is to beg the question, I guess, but hypothetically, if consciousness is not fundamental, and if it does wind up emerging some point in the evolutionary process, as many people believe, there would presumably be a time before which anything was conscious, out of which that consciousness needed to emerge. And so there would have then been stuff around that was not itself conscious, but would give rise to consciousness. And this seems to be the big kind of like question of, well, how can we possibly make sense of that? And that, in a sense, is what then it sounds like drives Whitehead to say, no, that's why we can't, that's not a workable idea. If you define nature as that which you are aware of in perception, then nature inherently always has to have some kind of perceiving aspect to it in order to be nature by definition.
Or
Um,
science at least presupposes that there be a perceiver capable of systematically studying
Well, now, but that would
perceptions.
be different though, because then science can say science is something that humans do because we have consciousness and perception. But when we go down that consciousness stack and where we get to a point where it is just, minerals that don't have consciousness, let's say, or you go back to the Big Bang and it's just radiation or something, right? It's sort of like, well, how do we make sense of this from these kinds of frameworks? And I can see why if that's sort of the orientation into this problem, why it is a resolution to this kind of deep issue, because you'd have to say, well, no, there is no fundamental discontinuity, and if we just say that it's all continuous, then there is no possibility for the bifurcation of nature to ever occur, because there's never any actual inner outer kind of thing that shows up. And I guess that is sort of the attraction for this philosophical resolution, because compared to, you know, the dominant emergentist or other kinds of mechanistic, let's say, answers, there isn't a good resolution to that. Is that more or less the issue?
Yeah, I mean, this was the fault line in the debates which erupted 15 years ago or so, when speculative realism was all the rage, and Graham Harman and Quentin Meillassoux and others uh, defined this notion of correlationism and went on the attack against phenomenology and the phenomenologists for thinking of consciousness as transcendental, and thinking that everything we might come to know about nature is always going to be correlate to a consciousness. And as Quentin Meillassoux would say, he wanted a realism that would get us the great outdoors again, that we break out of his correlational enclosure. Um, and he
Hmm.
he really emphasizes what he calls the problem of ancestrality, which is precisely what you're pointing out, is that presumably consciousness, if you accept the basic physicalist story, consciousness could only emerge from the brain. And if you rewind the history of life on Earth and look the cosmic clock back several billion years, there was a time when there wasn't even a single cell that might have been
Yeah.
semi-sentient or whatever. And so there is a nature, in other words, external to thought, external to consciousness, external to anything phenomenological, Meillassoux would argue. And for me, this problem of ancestrality is one of the strong issues that leads me in the direction of some form of panpsychism or
Yeah.
panexperientialism. That's not the direction that they're going in this book.
Hmm.
Um, I think they do explore neutral monism, uh, and I think that's Evan Thompson is comfortable at least saying that we need a post-physicalist understanding of nature.
Hmm.
I don't think he's happy with most emergentist stories, though
Hmm.
he doesn't, I think, yet have any way of articulating an alternative that he's satisfied with. He doesn't seem to want to go all in with a kind of Whiteheadian approach
Hmm.
to these questions. Though I know he's going to engage more with that possibility in a follow-up book that he's working on, I think with the co-authors as
Hmm.
well. So we'll see where that goes. But this issue, ancestrality, is a major, I think, dent in the otherwise beautiful armor of the phenomenological tradition,
Hmm.
going back to Kant, ultimately, this transcendental phenomenology, where you bracket the question of where mind comes from, and you just point out that all of our knowledge of nature presupposes uh, that we have this logic and this direct encounter with space and time, and that from out of that horizon of ordered experience, we produce these abstract models, and that those are what's really secondary and what's basic, if not ontologically basic, then at least I mean, Kant would say epistemologically basic, and a phenomenologist would say experientially basic.
Well, I would want to explore the idea of abstraction itself as a kind of strange loop, which does give us really that is genuinely an advance of knowledge. I want to pivot a little bit for a second in some ways because I want to throw in Piaget to all this. And I'm pretty deep into these developmental models, and I know that you've explored that sort of stuff. Well, I believe so anyway, in terms of, familiarity, maybe particularly with like Ken Wilber's integral models and stuff. But I'm interested in the way that developmental kind of psychology and learning theory has presented us with some illuminating ways of looking at this topic, right? So Piaget would have said that abstractions get built up from kind of lower order representations, and lower order representations get built up from sensory motor actions. So like when you're a baby and you do things, you can coordinate your actions in such a way and have an impact on the world, and it kind of works to solve a particular problem, and so that becomes a new habit, and then you basically learn the world through your behavioral, really concrete, right? Really concrete behavioral sensory motor experience that then slowly, by means of these coordinations, builds up increasingly kind of elaborate or complex conceptual schemas over time, so that then when you talk about bedtime as a word, that is triggering in your mind a whole series of connected sensory experiences, right? Of like getting into bed and drinking a glass of water and being told a story and being right. And then that whole thing just like networks a bunch of sensory motor experiences. And now that's a representation. And now there's bedtime that we can talk about. And then you can network these together with other representations, right? So there's, oh, when mom is away and bedtime looks very different now than other kinds of bedtime, and so then you get the variation of that, and then slowly these build up, and the point is this process continues, and this is actually where abstraction comes from. And so a word like truth or something, or maybe that's a bad example, truthfulness or something, right, is actually something you can decompose into a lot of different representations, which are all based on very concrete actions in the world. And so there's something in this image that I find really interesting because it links abstraction to the concrete, right? But development and learning itself is a process that moves from the concrete to the abstract. And so I feel like, and to finish that story a bit, then you can start linking abstractions together and get ultimately up to these like very high level order principles, like, something like the idea of natural selection as a process operating in nature, something that holds across all these different domains or something. So the point I would want to suggest, though, is that abstraction from a Piagetian way of thinking about it is genuine knowledge enhancement. It's actually the progression of learning in the world that human beings experience. And that as we move through that spectrum and we're generating higher and higher order abstractions, that's real learning. So at the same time, though, that's all predicated on our immediate concrete sensory motor experience. And so I guess what I'm getting from this is that, like, yes, we can have our abstraction and need it too. We can have our sense that, yes, abstractions are really valuable, so long as we always tie them back to the lived reality and never kind of do this thing of just thinking that somehow what we've abstracted has its own independent existence, somehow separate from our own concrete example. So I don't know, respond to that a little bit, just in terms of the idea that actually increasing levels of abstraction are genuine learning rather than us getting further away from reality.
Hmm. Well, I think this sort of um, Piagetian developmental account of how we learn language and linguistic abstraction in particular is right on target and super important to ground all of that in sensory motor experience. And I think of, Mark Johnson and George Lakoff's work on the way that metaphors are tied to the kinesthetic and proprioceptive like feelings that we have as being
Mm-hmm.
a body navigating a world, that the way that we speak is very much drawing on directly those regions of the brain responsible for these sensory motor
Mm-hmm.
loops that allow us to navigate our environments. And so linguistic abstraction is rooted in this in our embodiment, and I think that's right on. And I just don't think that, again, as we were talking about earlier, that's the origin of abstraction.
Mm,
Um, Already the sensory channels that our physiology and nervous system have abstracted from interaction with the environment are the substructure out of which these linguistic abstractions can then grow, you know. And
hmm.
so again, it's what's concrete and what's abstract is relative to, you know, what's the most concrete thing that we could possibly imagine. I think that's an interesting question to ask. You know, like
Hmm.
what's the bottom level here? And is it something like the universe as a whole? But then you have to think temporally. So it's like the universe as a whole after it's finished becoming whatever it is. I mean, you know,
Well, let
so
me. I have a specific question, but I don't want to interrupt your train of thought. But it builds on that what you were just saying.
I at some point would like to say a little bit about you know, how Whitehead approaches this question in his mature metaphysics with the idea of conceptual prehensions and eternal objects, how
Hmm.
that relates to the, but let me hear
Okay,
your
yeah, I
question. I'll get
figure
back to
we'll
that.
come back to that because I also want to talk to you about Plato in a second, but which I think will relate to that. But like, so to use the example of quantum mechanics, right? Now you could say that this is such an elaborate. I mean, this is the pinnacle of abstraction, really, right? When you drill down into the deep, 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 tiny, 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 and you get to this place that is so incomprehensible to us from our lived experience. Um, and that it can really only be explained with equations. Um, what do we do with that kind of thing, right? Do we because I hear some people say, yeah, we can't trust that because it doesn't actually have any there's nothing about quantum mechanics that relates to my experience of reality. Therefore, that's a good tell that we've just reified some abstraction that actually has nothing to do with reality because we need to look to our sense experience to tell us what reality is. I had a conversation with Zach Stein, and my impression is that he holds some view like that. I've heard you question other kinds of models, though they're usually more cosmological. I'm not sure exactly where you come down on quantum mechanics per se. But similarly, there's a sense of, oh, if you think that what's ultimately fundamental is a probability equation, and then, rather than your own experience of reality, then we've done that misplaced concreteness thing. At the same time, though, isn't it also the case that if we've just gotten to these equations and these conclusions based on our ability to learn in a Piagetian sense through abstraction, and this is what we come up with, then shouldn't we kind of trust that in a sense as being somehow deeply primary to the constitutive fabric of reality? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll lean on the philosopher of physics, Tim Maudlin, whose little book on the philosophy of quantum physics begins with the controversial claim that there's no such thing as quantum theory. Um, there are dozens of different interpretations of what the
Hmm.
findings of 100 years of quantum mathematics and experimentation have shown, but he thinks there's what we can say is there's a recipe for making certain kinds of predictions.
Hmm.
And as a recipe for making predictions, quantum physics is the most successful
Yeah.
special science in history. Um, but then, of course, what it means
Yeah.
in relationship to the world we experience is anybody's best guess.
Hmm.
And very, very smart people continue to disagree vehemently with each other on this
Uh-huh.
question.
Yeah.
And so, uh, as a as a way of instrumentally engaging human beings, instrumentally engaging, with our sensory motor loops, and extending our capacity for sensation and interaction with the physical world with various forms of instruments and measuring devices. And what is brought forth out of all of that is a very real procedure for um, constructing a future. And like it's strange to me, and I can see how someone might neglect this obvious fact, but to say that this doesn't affect my life at all, when I don't know if you were having a conversation with somebody over Zoom when they said that, but like if it weren't for the technologies that
Right.
this recipe makes possible,
Right.
our lives would be very different right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
We would be living like human beings have lived for most of our history on this planet.
Yeah.
And so the technological application of quantum physics makes it very clear that we're talking about something real here.
Right.
Um, But
Well, and
yeah,
and that is really important to me because going back to that question of what do we mean by real, that's kind of where I tend to bottom out on that question is like it's hard for me at a certain point to parse the difference between yes, this is really helpful to make accurate predictions about our lived experience and some other kind of ontology. Because for me, it's sort of like, well, isn't that what the whole Piagetian learning thing is about? Is like it's accommodation to reality. And if you can, if you can optimize your existence in your space and increase your causal power in the world by means of some understanding of something, isn't that what we mean by knowledge? And isn't knowledge a sense, an understanding of reality? And so there's something to me about, I don't want to be some kind of cheap utilitarian about all this, but there does seem to be this sense in which whatever we mean by knowledge of the world and reality, and thus what is real, does seem to have a deep connection with our ability to um, make claims that enhance our causal power in the actual world in which we're operating. And if that means that we can use an equation about quantum phenomena that we don't actually understand, but it still has an impact, then to me, I'm willing to say like whatever that equation that equation is bumping up against reality in some way, even if we don't understand it. And the fact that we don't understand it doesn't mean that we should reject the equation because, well, it doesn't comport with my lived small sense of being a human being. It means that we've been able to use our abstraction to get us in touch with a deep element of reality, and that is in a sense more real. I don't want to say more real, right? It's as real as my own experience, even if it's very hard for me to assimilate that equation to my human scale reality. Oh, so many thoughts there, but do you know what I mean?
absolutely. Quantum physics definitely has ontological implications and importance. It's just a very difficult, everybody agrees. Well, I think maybe not everybody agrees with that. Some people think quantum theory is incomplete and we need a different approach. I think even Roger Penrose believes that about
Mm.
quantum theory. But for people who think that most physicists and commentators who know anything think that there's some quantum theory has some purchase, or quantum physics, if there's not a theory per se, reveals something about the nature of reality. But then it's like, well, what exactly does it reveal?
Mhm.
I think the misplaced concreteness here might happen, or the model centrism might take over when we look at the Schrodinger wave equation and think, that's the real, and you'll end up with the many worlds interpretation or
Right.
something.
Right. No, and I want to ask you that because that for me would be a textbook case of misplaced concreteness of, oh, this equation has an infinite number of solutions, therefore there are an infinite number of worlds. It's like,
Yeah.
whoa, wait a second. And not only that, it's an inherently unscientific conclusion because it means that you can't actually test it. And so it becomes this metaphysical statement that for whatever reason, some scientists are just like, oh yeah, that's real, and we're like, wait. So anyway, what do you make of that? I think that the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics is classic. You've just extrapolated from an equation some set of ontological realities that don't actually exist. What do you think?
Yeah, I know, I totally agree with that. It's ontological overflow is the phrase
Mm,
that my physicist friend Timothy Eastman uses. Um, so I would not want to draw that ontological conclusion from quantum physics, but I think there are certain hints that it gives us about the nature of reality that have to do with, the question of determinism, the
mhm,
question of whether nature is just the sum total of already existing things, or if when we think about what nature is, we also have to include possibility among alongside actuality.
mm,
And so that there is a real fuzziness to how the physical world unfolds moment by moment. And in Whitehead's way of speaking, I think this is a great segue into his idea of conceptual prehension. Uh, Physical processes are always also already engaged in mental processes, but he doesn't mean consciousness when he talks about conceptual prehension. This is all happening unconsciously. Even in human beings, there's conceptual prehension going on that's largely unconscious. Consciousness is a different thing I'll get to in a second, hopefully, that Whitehead defines very specifically. But when we're talking about a quantum event when the Schrodinger wave equation becomes relevant for predicting where an electron is going to be the next time we make a measurement. In Whitehead's view, what's happening there is that there's an interplay between physical prehension, which is our normal understanding of how the past is inherited, and in some way, the present conforms with the past. But with quantum phenomena, it's very clear that that conformation is not lock solid. There's free
Mm-hmm.
play there.
Mm-hmm.
And so the conceptual prehension is, the next phase, let's say, in the concrescence of an actual occasion, after the conformal physical feelings, the conceptual feelings or conceptual prehensions are exploring relevant possibilities
Mm-hmm.
for what to actualize next. And so Whitehead would say we can talk about decisions occurring even at the quantum
Mm.
level with electrons and photons, and so
And it
it's not a
sounds like
conscious decision, but
that almost sounds like a kind of third way between what's often paraded out as the couple of possibilities, right? Like Einstein was looking for the deep determinism, God doesn't play dice. And so he spent the whole, some would say wasted the whole last part of his career looking for the classical in the quantum is my understanding, right? But then other people are just like, nope, it's just chance. It's just fundamentally we live in a probabilistic universe. And it almost sounds like what you're articulating or what Whitehead was speaking to is this notion that, well, it's not deterministic because it's not this classical sense of it has to go one place the way that Einstein was looking for. I hope I said Einstein earlier, not Newton. I might
you
have.
said Einstein, yeah.
Okay, good. So it's not that, but it's also not this just purely probabilistic thing, right? It's a in the same way that well, I have a vast possibility space and I can move my body in all sorts of dimensions and do all sorts of things. But if I were very, very small and had a couple of degrees of freedom, right, um, then there is still this openness there, and it might not be totally random a decision that I make, but it's not going to be totally determined either. And it sounds like this is the view that's being articulated about what's happening even at the quantum level, that these equations are kind of capturing that aspect of reality. Is that the idea?
Yeah, no, I think that would be the ontological implication that I would want to draw
Hmm.
from quantum physics is that rather than the Copenhagen approach, which is often, the shorthand account is that somehow the observation of a conscious being collapses the wave function, and that the universe isn't there when you're not looking at it or something. And I
Mm-hmm.
know there are subtler ways of, explaining the Bohr's understanding of quantum theory, but rather than having to say that the human observer has some special role here in the transition from the quantum to the classical, it's that nature is observing itself,
Mm-hmm.
and that there are decisions happening, decisions among possibilities with some degree of confirmation to the past, but still room for free play, to ingress alternatives, to ingress possibilities. And that's what conceptual prehension is all about for Whitehead,
Mm-hmm.
that nature is also making decisions. And this is where the idea that abstraction is part of nature cashes out. It's that, um, another way of thinking about what abstraction is, it's exploring the relevant possibilities that are not part of your actual experience,
Mm-hmm.
right?
To get trippy dippy here for a second.
Oh, I thought we were already on it.
Well, I mean, I don't know, to go woo. Um, this sounds like this deep kind of will. I don't know. Obviously, language becomes inherently difficult, right? But we're talking. We've talked about, and we are talking about the fact that consciousness is a rather late, uh, uh, you know, persona in this cosmic drama, but that through prehension this goes much further down. And if you're getting all the way down to the quantum level and there's some kind of decision making, that's the term you used, and I don't know what other synonyms you might use for that, but usually obviously we would think of decisions and choosing as some um faculty of a willful perceiving sentient aware creature, but not necessarily. That can be unconscious, that there's a choosing happening at a very, very primary level. And I guess the question is sort of like, if we're talking about some kind of choice faculty at the most fundamental level of existence, um I mean, is that even something? How do we begin to wrap our minds around that? and I guess that what immediately comes to mind is that we do some kind of a look inward to our own experience for this kind of uh, cue for what that is.
I mean, to me, it feels like a rather simple argument is it's that if you want to take your own will seriously, if you believe that effort counts for anything, and that you have a capacity, some degree of capacity under constraint, obviously, to make decisions about what you're going to do next and what you value and so on, then um, that there's certain ontological preconditions for that to be possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something like the idea that, as Schelling put it, will is primal being,
Mm-hmm.
uh, something, and I'm not a pessimist like Schopenhauer, but this idea that reality is fundamentally an unconscious will. The
Mm-hmm.
universe begins as an unconscious will and is
Yeah.
gradually trying to wake up
Right.
um, by making a lot of mistakes. So this isn't intelligent design. This is
Yeah.
a blind will initially striving to become more aware of what the fuck is going on. And as a result of a trial and error process
Yeah.
that's also driven by a longing to wake up,
Right.
evolution and learning can unfold. But if you don't begin with some modicum of striving or will or eros, I don't
Yeah.
see how it could ever come, you know, be excreted out of this
Sure.
merely mechanistic process
Well,
sometime later.
I'm it's funny, well, I'm I'm in this process of going back towards a more kind of panpsychic view or whatever term, because I'm finding a lot of this very compelling, for sure. And
All
it,
part of
it
my plan.
your will. Um, but at the same time, as I've said in the past, it both resolves a lot of things, but it also opens up a lot of unresolved questions, or you could say problems. How does one, so like this would be one we're talking about waking up, right? But like if I try to conceive of my will when I am unconscious, that's very hard for me to do. When I think about me sleeping at night and I lose consciousness, and then I wake up the next morning. I mean, what does it mean for me to understand that there's some aspect of myself in my unconscious state that was willing? Is that what we'd have to say something like that, or in order even just to analogously imagine what such a primal will would be like?
I mean, I think we have depth psychology to really fill in a lot
Mm,
of this for us. The idea of the unconscious psyche is pretty widespread, and you know that the body has its own impulses and instincts, and that we are more or less compound organisms,
hmm
physiologically and psychologically. We're a plurality, and whether we're talking about each of our organ systems, which synergize with one another amazingly well when we're healthy,
hmm
but are also just going about their business, doing their thing. The heart cells know when to beat, and the liver knows how to, filter the blood, um, and psychologically, I think maybe I don't know, there are different models of psychological development, but there's obviously this whole domain of the metamodern spirituality and then transpersonal psychology and all these things. We're trying to gesture toward and stabilize modes of consciousness, modalities of awareness that are beyond just egocentric,
hmm
I, me, mine. And these we're trying to grow new organs of
mm
perception,
hmm hmm
and that is a collective process as much as it is an individual process. But we're always dealing with um, many wills. Every cell in my body has the will to survive, and presumably desires to get nutrition, and also has this larger identity that emerges.
Well, here's a question.
Uh, yeah,
Is that deep primal will that we're talking about, can I, one, contact that? I would have to, I would assume, based on all that we've been talking about, looking for the concrete, as if it's outside concrete access, then somehow it would seem to be that's a sign of we're doing a misplaced concreteness thing here. We're abstracting something that probably isn't real. I could be misreading some of that, but there seems to be a kind of epistemology here that's like, well, if I am the universe undergoing this process, then I should be able to find some deep aspect of this in my own experience to some degree. And I think this is where the anthroposophy and, Zach and the whole what does he call it? Anthro-ontology, this sort of thing is sort of, and Goethe and all that stuff. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like that's sort of the one of the driving insights of like there that there is within the ken of my own phenomenological experience, um, the data
Yeah.
for being able to support any claims that I'm proposing about kind of fundamental reality.
It's
Oh, yeah.
human as microcosm.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So if that's the case, and I can locate the sense of will in myself, and I can see that maybe this is some deep analog to this primal thing that we can see even happening at the quantum level. Here's my question. Is that the same in you and in each of your cells? Like, is this some how like I'm trying to think of the ontology of that thing, right? Is this some kind of monistic, you know, omnipresent thing that we're all kind of participating in our own embodied ways? Is that it? That's a question.
I mean, so, from like an anthroposophical
Well, what
perspective,
does the Matt Segall perspective say?
uh, I think every being, every organism, and maybe even every actual occasion, like thinks it's human, which is to say, experiences the universe as if it were at the center.
Hmm.
So we live in an omnicentric universe, and whatever we mean by human, with all of the exceptional characteristics that we like to attribute to it, I would say is actually something. And you asked what I think, and this is a perennial, perspective that the anthropos is this sort of cosmic archetype towards which all evolution is drawn
Hmm.
and lured.
Hmm.
And the anthropos is like the wisest, most compassionate being that could be imagined, and that's sort of the telos of the whole universe. But
Hmm.
there are also all of these constraints and limitations. And uh, I've been studying Charles Saunders Peirce recently, so he would say secondness, which is like, I don't know if anyone knows Peirce's logic. I'm not going to
Hmm.
get into that right now, but um, evil is what it's called in a religious sense. That uh, means that there needs to be a historical process. It doesn't just happen all at once. We don't just
Hmm.
get to be that perfect being.
Hmm.
We have to become that, and that becoming could be an infinite process.
Hmm.
But and indeed, I think it is infinite. And so when you talk about the scales and like the degrees to which
Hmm.
the anthropos archetype is realized by a cell in my lungs versus a single atom of carbon,
Hmm.
it's like, yeah, we could say there are higher and lower degrees of like achieving this fuller, like incarnating this archetype more
Yeah.
fully.
Yeah.
But if there's really an infinite scale here, uh, that
Yeah.
starts to,
Well, this is
scramble the
really cool because
hierarchy.
this is a great segue into, if we wanted to go there, which we should at some point, metamodern Christianity, because I feel what you just talked about as the anthropos archetype would be what I would refer to as the Christ archetype, and so I mean in a
So would I. I was just being a little bit more inclusive by not
no,
choosing
but
that.
well, and for I mean because certainly, I mean as we should also, I think, because and I would even suggest that's the direction in which the Christ archetype probably is unfolding, because Christ is a historically contingent, contextualized, embedded term that is also then going to be uh, antagonistically, it's going to be alien to other traditions that aren't able to engage with it on those terms, but could engage with it on the deeper, more universal term. And in some sense, the anthropos is a more universal human idea than Christ per se. And so you could make the argument that, that's part of that. So I just wanted to say that for the record, but I also, I mean, just to linger on this point for a second. Yeah, you took that in the direction of scale. I was taking it more in the direction of like, and I don't even know, this is where like the words things becomes difficult, but like there's a sense in which It's all right. So I recently saw a video floating around the internet of Neil deGrasse Tyson entertaining this idea that there's only one electron. He's not saying that that's the case, but there's this theory out there of, well, if you think about it this way, then there's only one electron. And I'm not trying to make that argument either. In fact, I think that's probably wrong. But the idea is that you could think about, oh, this thing that we thought was plural in inhabiting all these different things, if we actually think about the fact that, like, when we zoom way down, all these things are kind of happening at sort of an atemporal scale, and maybe you only need one of them to be affecting everything in the whole universe. Something like that, with the idea of this primal will of, like, if that's happening all the way down at the quantum level, but at the same time it's happening everywhere in every instance of everything moving towards a similar direction, then you get a kind of monistic picture in which everything is this kind of will in different incarnated forms, along a different kind of, spectrum or something like that. And so I don't know, there's something kind of mystical in the sense of the unity perspective that idea would offer. So that was kind of where my question was going, and I think your answer related to that, but from a different angle. Anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I don't. That wasn't even a question per se. It was just maybe a clarifying point. At this point, I have two things I could go into. We could then segue into metamodern Christianity based off of what we were just talking about. But there's also this lingering thing about Plato that also I think is also maybe something we could get into first. So maybe I could just go there for a second. So here would be my thought about this. Now, obviously, you're, Whitehead scholar. Whitehead famously quipped that all philosophy is, footnotes to Plato. Your handle is footnotes to Plato. You've got Socrates literally, pasted behind you on the wall. So I want to get your take on the Platonic view of some of this, because it could be viewed hypothetically as misplaced concreteness run amok, right? If you get this process of abstraction based on sensory motor, concrete phenomena. I've been tempted to read Plato through the lens of mistaking abstraction as like as the quintessential misplaced concrete thing. Meaning, what does he do? He looks at the ability of the mind to abstract things, and then he says, rather than this all being, predicated on lower level concrete phenomena, this is actually the fundamental nature of reality, and from this idealist plane, everything is actually just abstractions, and everything concrete is lesser and less real than the abstraction. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because at the same time you seem to have some reverence for Plato, but on the other hand, he would seem to, from one interpretation, be the kind of most guilty misplaced concreter there was. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Platonism is often synonymous with this two-world dualism that you can certainly find evidence for in his dialogues. Um, I always like to remind people that the best refutations of Plato's ideas, including the idea of ideas, all those are also in Plato's dialogues.
Hmm.
And so when Whitehead says footnotes to Plato, the safest characterization of the history of European philosophy is that it's a series of footnotes to Plato. He means Plato not as a systematizer that has one theory. He means Plato as the author of dialogues,
Yeah.
exploring different possibilities, and ending most of the dialogues with the kind of aporia, or Socrates being like, well, I guess that's as far as we could take this question. And then there's some kind of myth that gives you some metaphorical sort of imagery that might give you a deeper insight into what's ineffable about this. And so do I think of Plato, is my Plato a two-world dualist? No. Are there some problems with the Platonic theory of ideas? Yes. Which is why I'm so drawn to Whitehead. He basically inverts this hierarchy and makes actual experience primary and of greater ontological value than the eternal objects, which become deficient in actuality. And so that inversion is very important. It's a more incarnational Platonism, if you want. But even in Plato, if we read, say, the Republic and the divided line analogy, where he kind of lays out his his hierarchy of being and theory of knowledge, the sensible on one side and the intelligible on the other. Why can't we read that, or I would suggest that we read that as a kind of pedagogical maneuver? And the analogy of the cave is the allegory of the cave is, I think, an illustration of this divided line metaphor. Uh, and understand this not as just Plato saying we must escape the illusion of the sensible into the pure abstraction of the intelligible, because that's only a 180-degree turn. The prisoner freed from the chains and escaping. But the thing is, the escapee comes back to try to rescue others. Socrates stays in Athens and tries to um, show others that there's something beyond just dianoia. There is also noesis, and there's obviously something beyond just our opinions about what we think we see in the sensory world. So there is this hierarchy of knowledge in Plato, but we have to complete. The way I put this in an essay I've written on this particular question is that we need a 360 Platonism, not just a 180 Platonism. So the metanoia is all the way back around again to see the sensible world with archetypal eyes,
Mm.
which is to say, having been initiated into the the fact that there is intelligibility and the deep mystery, like they didn't have to be this way, that there should be an intelligible order, that mathematics should give us such deep insight into the structure
Mhm.
of the world around us. And so that for Plato is a revelation. Nature itself and its intelligibility becomes a revelation. He looked up at the movement of the heavenly bodies and the planets, the wanderers, and said, that's too disordered. There must be some deeper explanation here. That intuition is at the root of science and
Mhm.
scientific inquiry, that no, there must be an intelligible explanation for what appears to me to be chaotic, right? And so um, a full 360 Platonism then is like we understand the divided line example that Plato lays out in the Republic as a pedagogical maneuver to get us to consider the deep mystery of intelligibility and
Mhm.
that we are intelligent enough to decipher
Mhm.
the intelligibility of the cosmos, but to transform our perception so that we don't think what we're looking at is just a bunch of sensory surfaces chaotically uh, misarranged, but that there's actually a deeper order to be discovered, and that we can cultivate and develop our own minds so as to discover that. But it's not, I would resist the two world understanding because that's like only going halfway with
Yeah.
what Plato is really proposing here. We have
Yeah.
to complete the circle.
It does seem there is this deep tension there where, I'm reminded of people who like have these t-shirts with like, the 20 major equations of fundamental physics that, mistakenly, but people will say, oh, they explain everything. Obviously they don't.
Yeah,
But
that's Sean Carroll's core theory, so called, which I have a lot of problems with
yeah,
too.
okay. And I mean, obviously it doesn't, but maybe it maybe explains a lot of the physical world. But still there's this sense of we look for that elegance and that simplicity, and we see that in the mathematical descriptions that we give to phenomena, and the fact that they're able to account for the behavior of phenomena in these kinds of abstract ways. There is something intelligible and beautiful about that. And we almost revere that. And I think arguably scientists and mathematicians have a kind of almost sacred relationship to these things in a way that they wouldn't acknowledge as religious, but I think is a kind of echo of that religious sensibility. But I guess what I'm getting at is just that there seems to be something fraught in this whole relationship to these things, that it's sort of like on the one hand we acknowledge that we see the beauty of it, we see the deep intelligibility of reality, we see something even sacred and divine about that. On the other hand, isn't that all the very essence of this misplaced concreteness of like thinking that the Schrodinger equation is somehow ultimately true? And you know what I mean? So I'm still grappling with that as a
Yeah.
kind of tension.
Well, this is where I think Goethe and his whole scientific method is actually the deeper kind of Platonism that I'm trying to describe here,
Hmm.
where we want to not take flight from the phenomena and not run from the sensory world, but come to see how the phenomena can display for us that we can read the phenomena and interpret the phenomena so as to elicit from them this intelligibility. And sometimes equations can help us do that. Uh, there's an analogy to be made between, say, like the Fibonacci sequence and the equation by which you can produce the next numeral in that
Hmm.
sequence, and what Goethe is talking about with his study of the metamorphosis of plants, where you observe many instances of plant growth, and you distill the form, the Erbpflanze that underlies that sequence of metamorphosis. And then once you have this Erbpflanze, Goethe would say, just like when you have the equation to produce the next numeral in the Fibonacci sequence, you can produce a new plant that might not exist anywhere on Earth, but that nonetheless is a real plant in the sense that the same formal law would be underlying it and producing it. So Goethe would say, as an artist, now I can use this Erbpflanze. If I were a painter, say, I can create plants that might not exist anywhere in nature, but they could exist.
Mm.
And so similarly, you can distill through rightly arranged series of phenomena the form that underlies the phenomena that's not separate from the phenomena. And we don't want to think of this form as a static, eternal thing.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic, purposeful process. And so, you know, we want the forms to be incarnate in the things, right? And
Yeah.
but they're not merely just our constructed description, right? There's a real form incarnating in the plant,
Hmm.
right? And that form would be merely abstract if it were still in the mind of God, say, and if there
Right.
wasn't an
Right.
actual plant world that manifests it.
Well, this gets us nicely back. I don't know, every time I hear the word incarnational, of course, my mind goes to the Christian tradition. And so, I mean, there is a really interesting way of tying all these ideas we've been exploring to an interpretation of sort of the Christian mythos of Jesus as the specific, concrete, incarnational instantiation of the Erbpflanze, Erbpflanze well, I guess what you could say is the kind of that Christ is the icon of God, that there is some kind of image that needs to be incarnated for it to actually be deeply valuable or real even, and before or otherwise it remains in the level of abstraction, and isn't realized. And so there's something about the sacred call to instantiate, to incarnate the divine archetype, in your own, I would say, immediate, concrete, experiential reality, and therefore also then see that this pattern is one that is, in a sense, kind of replicable or instantiatable, in many, many different contexts. That's one way of thinking about that. I don't know if you have any ideas that you'd want to throw in.
Well, this process of archetypal metamorphosis that Goethe sees in plant life, and he sees in color phenomena as well, and he sees in the morphology of our bones, and how the human being relates to other vertebrates, and the way in which um, it's Goethe describing the process of incarnation. And I think you know the difficult uh, questions here to explore in the context of a religion like Christianity, when we look at this historical figure, Jesus, and trying to parse the extent to which the particularity of that is adequate to the Christ as
Hmm.
either a cosmic power or an archetype, if we want to psychologize it. Uh, I don't like to equate the two. I think I'm I'm less concerned with the historical figure, and is the Bible,
Yeah.
historical document,
Yeah.
or, you know, adjudicating how much literal truth we could get out of different statements. To me, the Bible is, uh, I read it as poetry, and poetry is this most sacred thing we have. Poetry is scripture,
Hmm.
and that the revelation that Christians would say begins and ends with the Bible, I would say no fucking way does it begin and end with the Bible. Um, there's apocryphal texts which are directly about even Jesus that we might want to think about too.
And there's also canonized texts that draw on apocryphal texts that, so even kind of
Yeah,
secondhand, takes in some
to
of that stuff.
begin with,
Yeah, right, right.
and then I think art and religion used to, and spirituality used to be, and science actually, compact. And in our modern civilization, these things have differentiated. But you know, art, poetry, and all the other art forms, I think, are just can be and should be. I'll make that normative claim of uh, spiritual import,
Yeah,
and are in that sense our way of continuing the process of revelation. Um,
yeah.
and I think when art becomes detached from that sacred mission,
Mm.
it quickly degenerates into different
Yeah.
ways.
Well, all that's very
Um,
much music, sacred music to my ears, as that was really the hook that brought me back into engagement with spirituality was art and the potential role of the poet, of the artist as prophet, really, as the continual conduit for divine revelation in the world by means of continuing to instantiate and realize the sacred archetypes in reality. And for the record, when I talk about archetype, it's true. I that word probably lands very psychological given where it comes from, but I also tend to use that word with a much more expansive cosmic scope, in almost a kind of etymological sense, like the arche and the typos. There's and you can view that through just a psychological lens, but I think it should extend beyond that. If actually, even from a psychological angle, just because we're transpersonal in our psychology, it's inherently, it's a hence, I think Jung's kind of collective consciousness or unconsciousness bit in the sense that these archetypes are beyond us and in the world.
yeah,
Anyway, just wanted to make that point. But to that point, I when I was in the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale Divinity School doing a religion and the arts major for this purpose, I took a year-long Dante course, and Dante for me is really an exemplar of this, of someone who through his art and his poetry creates, in a sense, a kind of second Bible that encapsulates all this knowledge and learning and yearning of the Christian tradition through the millennia in a particular text. And the way that text culminates is with this divine vision, as he's ascending up into the Empyrean in Paradiso. In the final cantos, in the final canto, I even think what he sees there is the emergence, in the center of the Empyrean, of all these swirling angels and faces and people, this singular face, which is the Christ face. Essentially, it is the incarnated kind of person of Christ. But it's also so much more. I mean, it's God. It's the human. It's like it's everything is kind of headed towards this singularity almost of the face of God. And I find that a very beautiful image for this process, and for kind of when I think about the teleology of the universe itself, I draw on a lot of Dante's formulation of this, and I think that there's something to that, for sure. And I think in a beautiful way, it does radically home us in the universe rather than thinking about ourselves as being fundamentally alien to the cosmos and this strange random thing on some rock somewhere hurling in space, but actually like the point through which the very kind of progression of all of the universal levels of existence are kind of coming together and finding their culmination. And that's a lot to say. So I think all that is very wonderful and true and beautiful. And then I also want to throw in too, there's also this side of me that wants to always be on the lookout for a certain kind of narrow anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism, and all the dangerous ways that we know that actually the opposite of learning is assimilation to our own prejudiced categories of what we think are important based on our prior experience. And so anyway, I'm just going to not even pose that as a question. I'm just going to throw all of those words at you and see how you might reply.
yeah, lovely. And I know we should probably wrap up soon here,
Mm.
but I think the way to avoid that kind of narrow anthropocentrism is to always remember that, as I said before, every being thinks that it's human. And so we have the best place for us to look for what really the human is all around us,
Mm,
right? And the more we study nature, the more we're learning about ourselves. And actually, to bring it back around, for those who came for the blind spot phenomenological critique of science and ended up in this discussion about mystical Christianity, um, like there's a way in which science could only ever be a deeper immersion in this strange loop whereby
mm,
we come to know the universe from a human perspective. We could not but know the universe
mm,
from a human perspective. And I think this more mystical approach that we've been exploring, whereby the anthropos becomes this cosmic archetype, allows us to always remember that we learn as much about our own humanity by studying the world around us as we
mm.
do by turning inward and exploring our own
Yeah.
depths, right? And the other thing I want to throw in here is this. Well, it's a plug for a book in part by Simon Critchley called "Faith of the Faithless,"
Mm,
and just on the connection between art and spirituality and Christianity in particular. He looks Critchley, who's at the New School, looks at Oscar Wilde
mm,
and what he calls wild Christianity,
uh-huh.
where when Wilde was imprisoned for 2 years for being
Yeah.
gay in 1895 to 97, and he wrote about Christianity there,
Hmm.
and kind of engages imaginatively with the Christ figure and develops what he calls a form of soul smithing, um, where he explores the incarnation as an artistic and the death and resurrection of Christ as this artistic imaginative deed.
Mm,
And so I just wanted to share what Wilde says here. He says, to the artist, expression is the only mode under which he can conceive life at all. To him, what is dumb is dead. But to Christ, it was not so. With a width and wonder of imagination that fills one almost with awe, I don't know why almost, why can't you fill with awe? He took the entire world of the inarticulate, the voiceless world of pain as his kingdom and made himself its external mouthpiece. Um,
mm,
and so, and, for Wilde, the reason that religion and spirituality must remain artistic and poetic is because, you know, on some level, each of us needs to create our own symbols.
mm,
Uh,
mhm,
because a symbol, the meaning of a symbol is so uh, fuzzy and can be somewhat arbitrary. And like each of us, like what is the Trinity?
mm,
Uh, I mean, thousands of years of discourse on that question, but to really understand it, I mean, anyone in the know knows
mm,
that you can't really know
mm, mhm,
uh, in a way that could be explicated and logically explained
mm,
what the Trinity is. It's a symbol that we each have to relate to at a transcognitive level, and so um, by virtue of that need for our own participation in the symbol for it to become meaningful to us,
mm,
if there's an artistic act that's required of us. And I think, what Wilde, who remained an atheist, but an atheist for whom the image of Christ and Jesus Christ in this case as artist
mm,
remained compelling to him, I
mm.
think is a good hint about what, even 130 years ago, metamodern Christianity might look like.
Yeah. Wow. Well said. Um, we should draw to a close. This has been awesome. I've really enjoyed it. I think we were able to get some really fascinating places. Again, I think of our conversations as a long unfolding conversation. We'll have another before long, and when we do, I would like to pick up on some of these threads around kind of carrying this deeper. I'm sort of at the edge of my thought at the moment around where and how this might lead into an appreciation of esotericism, which is something that I I'm very wary of because there's a way in which I'm always very concerned about centering the human as being a projective and assimilatory act rather than a kind of transcendent and self realization and learning act. there's a real danger there, as I was kind of naming earlier. And so I'm curious what you would make. We could talk about this at some other point about, how we make sure that we're not falling prey to certain kinds of projection or assimilation, but we're actually, what are the cues for
Mm.
finding deeper insights? How do we know when we look at nature and see ourselves that we're not just projecting onto nature? What are the degrees to which some kind of animistic sentiment is right, and to what degree is it just, again, kind of human projection? There's a profound way in which a similar move can be either profoundly sort of almost canonic and mystical, or it could either be profoundly narcissistic and egocentric. And there's strangely a fine line that can separate these things, right? There's almost like mystical unity or profound solipsism, and all these things seem to butt up against each other. And if we're not careful, we can fall into one of the darker versions of that. So anyway, those are always some things. And of course, there's always the perennial bullshitting that we want to avoid in any kind of wisdom practice. So those are some things that come up for me about potential next things. What for you in a future conversation would you want to dig into?
Well, as you know, every time you've spoken with John Vervaeke about
Mm,
metamodern Christianity, I've had a lot of reflections that I've shared and
yeah.
on my Substack, um, and we've got into some of that, but I know there's all sorts of questions, and it's related to the esoteric issue
Mm,
because
mm,
I would say uh, part of what has brought me back to Christianity is my appreciation for a figure like Rudolf Steiner, and
mhm,
I certainly would want to avoid what Freud to Jung called the black tide of occultism,
mm,
and the forms of assimilative anthropocentrism that you're describing, and hold the tension between the way in which uh, esoteric literature um, has inspired me, and also the danger of projection and ungrounded speculation.
mm,
And how to, just I would love to talk about my struggle with those questions
mm.
because I'm
Yeah,
both deeply, deeply inspired by uh, this problematic figure like Rudolf Steiner and by the whole history of esotericism generally,
sure.
but also recognize the pitfalls
Yeah.
and am honestly struggling to shed light on these questions and recover what can be recovered
Uh-huh.
and leave behind what's not of service,
Yeah.
to a mature spirituality.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we've got our kind of path set for us. I'm glad it's at this moment that I'm feeling that fuzziness again of my. So I'm glad that I was able to hold. We were able to.
I hope you don't collapse in exhaustion after this.
Well, if so, it'll have been well worth it because this was really great. Cool. Well, yes. So we've got our work cut out for us next time, whenever that is. But it's been wonderful having these conversations with you, Matt. You're wonderful to talk to. Always feel like I learned something, or I have my understanding expanded, or consider some new thought. And you also are just a real wealth of you've read so widely, and I love the references that you can throw in, and you bring a lot of that whole bookcase behind you into these conversations in a really wonderful way. To say nothing, of course, of your profound understanding of Whitehead, who is opaque to many without translation such as yours. So anyway, just to say much thanks, really appreciated it, and we will talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. You're a wonderful host, and takes two to tango. So appreciate what you're able to draw out of me in these conversations, which I find of immense value as well,
Lovely.
and all the other work that you're doing.
Thanks, man.
Keep
Appreciate
it
it.
up. So
All
until
right.
next time.
Godspeed.